They called her the Ice Queen of London, a billionaire who built an empire from nothing and destroyed anyone who stood in her way. But behind those marble walls, power had become her prison. For 40 years she ruled in silence, until a young cleaner stepped into her house, and unknowingly into her past. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to scandal. And soon, the world would brand her a monster for the one thing she had never dared to be: human. As the cameras flashed outside her gates, and the empire she built began to crumble, one question echoed through the house she once commanded. What happens when the most powerful woman in Britain asks for something the world says she doesn't deserve? Love? Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The morning light crept slowly over Kensington, touching the rooftops with a kind of reluctant warmth, as if even the sun hesitated to disturb the quiet grandeur of the Harrington estate. The mansion stood like a monument to time itself: marble walls, tall iron gates, and windows so clean they reflected the cold gray sky. Inside, clocks ticked in perfect rhythm, their sound echoing softly through the empty halls, each tick a small reminder that even silence was alive. Margaret Harrington moved through that silence like a ghost who refused to vanish. Her cane tapped lightly against the marble floor as she made her way down the corridor, her reflection breaking across every glass surface she passed. The once beautiful face now traced with the delicate lines of age, the eyes still sharp, but heavy with the weight of memory. She had been a queen once, the iron-fisted CEO of Harrington Capital, a name that made boardrooms tremble. Men twice her size had bowed under her decisions. Headlines once called her the Steel Widow after she rebuilt her late husband's dying company into an empire. But empires, she'd learned, can't keep you warm at night. Now, at 85, the world she built had outgrown her. The company was run by younger executives who smiled politely but never looked her in the eye. They called her Madam Harrington out of formality, not respect. Her only true company was the sound of her footsteps in the hall and the whisper of old letters she could no longer bring herself to open. She slept in the smallest room of her mansion, not the master suite with its gilded mirrors and chandeliers, but a modest guest room tucked near the servants' quarters. The bed was narrow, the sheets white, the air still. At night, she sometimes woke gasping, unsure if she was still among the living or if she had already joined the ghosts she kept company with in her dreams. That morning, a new sound joined the mansion's silence, the steady rhythm of a mop gliding across polished floors. The new housekeeper had arrived. His name was Daniel Reed, 26, soft-spoken, the kind of young man who carried humility in his posture and warmth in his eyes. He moved with quiet efficiency, careful not to disturb the stillness around him. Daniel was from Southwark, a world away from the gleaming heart of Kensington. He had taken the job through an agency, never imagining he'd be cleaning the house of the legendary Margaret Harrington. To him, she was a myth, the woman who'd been quoted in newspapers and studied in business schools. Yet here he was, polishing the silver handles of doors she rarely opened. When they first crossed paths, it was purely accidental. He was dusting the library shelves when she entered unannounced, her presence cutting through the air like a cold wind. Daniel froze mid-motion, a cloth in one hand, a book in the other. She didn't speak at first, only glanced at him, assessing him with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people like financial reports. "You're new," she finally said. Her voice was low, cultured, and weary all at once. "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly. She studied him for another long moment before turning away. "Don't call me ma'am," she murmured. "Just do your work." That was all. No smile, no welcome. Just the sound of her cane fading down the corridor. Yet somehow, Daniel found himself wondering what kind of woman built an empire only to live alone inside its echo. By evening, rain began to fall over the city, heavy, relentless, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Daniel finished his shift and prepared to leave, but a sharp crash from the upper floor made him pause. He hesitated, then climbed the stairs. In the dim light of the study, he found her. Margaret stood still, her breathing uneven, a shattered vase at her feet. The fragments sparkled like broken stars across the floor. "It slipped," she said quietly, though her tone carried something more than carelessness, a fatigue too deep to name. Without a word, Daniel knelt and began gathering the pieces. His hands moved gently, almost reverently, as if each shard held a story. "Don't," she said suddenly. "I'll have it replaced." He didn't stop. "Some things can be fixed, ma'am," he said, then caught himself. "Sorry, Margaret." Her eyes, sharp even in her frailty, lifted to meet his. For the first time, there was a flicker of surprise. Most people never dared to call her by name. He could see it unsettled her, not because it was disrespectful, but because it reminded her she was still human. When he finished, he set the mended pieces gently on the table. "It won't be perfect," he said, "but it'll still be yours." The firelight caught his face as he spoke, sincerity etched across it, unguarded and pure. Margaret found herself studying him, not as an employee, but as someone she couldn't quite define. There was warmth in his presence, the kind that made the silence feel less suffocating. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain softened, the house seemed to exhale, and in that quiet exchange, something fragile and unnamed took root. That night, when Daniel left, Margaret lingered by the window, watching his shadow disappear through the gates. She caught her reflection in the glass, the proud, tired woman who had everything and nothing. For years, her wealth had bought her isolation disguised as dignity. Yet tonight, as the rain whispered against the glass, she felt something she hadn't in decades. Curiosity. Downstairs, the repaired vase sat imperfectly glued, its cracks visible under the lamplight. But to her eyes, it looked almost beautiful. Broken, yet whole again. She sat beside it for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond her walls. Somewhere inside her chest, a door she'd kept locked for 85 years creaked open just a little. And though she would never admit it, not to herself, not to anyone, she found herself hoping that the young man with the quiet eyes and steady hands would return the next day. For the first time in a long time, the mansion did not feel entirely silent. It breathed. It waited. It was as if, in that fleeting moment between rain and dawn, the ghosts of the Harrington estate had paused their endless wandering, to watch what might become of two souls from opposite worlds, colliding gently in the vast emptiness of a marble home. Little did either of them know that simple act, a broken vase and a shared silence, would be the beginning of something that would shake the walls of that mansion forever. The days began to fall into rhythm inside the Harrington mansion, a rhythm so precise it could have been written into the walls themselves. Daniel quickly learned that everything in that house ran on schedule. At exactly 6 a.m., the kettle would whistle in the kitchen, followed by the faint clink of porcelain from the breakfast tray. At 7 a.m., Margaret would take her tea, no sugar, no lemon, standing by the same window overlooking the mist-covered gardens. And by 8 p.m., the entire house would sink into silence so heavy it almost seemed sacred. Daniel respected her order, her rules, her solitude. He became part of the background, a moving shadow in her world of stillness. He polished brass handles, folded curtains, wiped dust from picture frames where the woman in the photographs smiled wider than the woman he now served. Sometimes he'd hear her cane tapping across the floorboards, steady and deliberate. Other times, she moved so quietly he'd turn and find her already standing behind him, studying him with eyes that saw everything. He never spoke unless spoken to. She never asked for conversation. It was an unspoken agreement between two lonely souls, one bound by discipline, the other by caution. Until one quiet afternoon. Daniel was dusting the piano in the drawing room when Margaret's voice broke the stillness. "Do you believe people can die of loneliness?" she asked, her tone detached, almost like she was asking about the weather. Daniel froze mid-motion. Her question hung in the air like a secret waiting to be confessed. He hesitated, unsure if it was a trap or an invitation. "I think people don't die of loneliness, ma'am," he said softly. "They just forget how to live." The words seemed to land somewhere deep inside her. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, her reflection merging with the fading light. "Forget how to live," she repeated under her breath. "Yes, that sounds about right." That single exchange, small, almost accidental, changed everything. From that day on, the silence between them began to shift. Margaret started speaking more often, her words carrying the weight of years no one had dared to ask her about. At first, her stories were sharp and distant, boardroom battles, newspaper wars, the cold satisfaction of watching rivals crumble. But then, her voice softened. She began to speak of things the newspapers never printed, her husband's infidelities, the child she miscarried in her 40s, the boardroom deal she won but regretted. Each story peeled away another layer of her armor. Daniel listened. He never interrupted, never filled the pauses. His silence became her permission to remember. One evening, she gestured to an old armchair by the fireplace, its cushion torn, the frame unstable. "That was my husband's," she said quietly. "He used to sit there for hours, reading letters that weren't addressed to me." Daniel knelt beside it, tracing the cracked wood with his hand. "Would you like me to fix it?" She hesitated. "It's just furniture." "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes the things we think are broken still deserve to stand." For a moment, she said nothing. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Very well." That night, Daniel stayed late, hammering and gluing until the chair could stand again. When he finished, Margaret approached, resting her hand on the restored armrest. Her eyes softened. "It's sturdier than I remembered." "So are you," he said quietly. She didn't reply, but when she turned away, her reflection in the window almost looked like it was smiling. In the days that followed, something invisible began to grow between them. She began calling him by his first name. He started leaving small things on her breakfast tray, fresh flowers, neatly folded napkins, sometimes a note with a quote he'd read. She never acknowledged them, but she never threw them away either. Daniel tended her neglected garden, pruning dead roses until the bushes bloomed again. She began spending her evenings by the window that overlooked those flowers. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her fingers would trace the rim of her teacup as though remembering the rhythm of another life. But peace, in a mansion that fed on gossip, never lasts long. Whispers began to drift through the hallways like smoke. The cooks murmured in the kitchen. The chauffeur avoided Daniel's eyes. The staff who once pitied Margaret now began to mock her in hushed tones. "She's growing soft. That boy's bewitched her." An old woman losing her mind over the help. Daniel tried to ignore them, but the words always found him. One morning, as he entered the pantry, the conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes glanced his way, smirking, suspicious. He knew the rhythm of judgment, the same rhythm he'd grown up with in poverty, where kindness was often mistaken for weakness. That evening, as he passed the grand staircase, he heard Margaret's voice from above, not sharp, not commanding, but trembling ever so slightly. "They're talking about us, aren't they?" Daniel froze. He hadn't realized she'd noticed. He looked up. She stood at the landing in her dark blue dress, the light from the chandelier reflecting off her silver hair. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed something new, fear. "Yes," he admitted softly. "But people talk when they see what they can't understand." Her lips parted, then closed again. For a moment, she looked far older than her years. "They call me the Ice Queen," she said, her voice faint. "I've worn that title like armor for so long, and now somehow, I'm ashamed of melting." Daniel wanted to answer, but she turned away, her cane tapping slowly down the hall. That night, Margaret sat in her study, staring at her reflection in the window. Behind her, the rain traced silver veins down the glass. Her tea had gone cold. The chair Daniel had repaired stood beside her, strong and patient, the only thing in the room that had truly been touched by care. She lifted her cup with trembling fingers and whispered to the empty air, "How strange it is, that kindness should feel more dangerous than cruelty." Downstairs, Daniel finished locking up the mansion, unaware that his quiet compassion had already begun to shift the heart of a woman the world believed unchangeable. In the darkness of that house, among the ticking clocks, the whispers, and the ghosts of her past, Margaret Harrington began to feel something she had forgotten existed, the fragile, terrifying warmth of being seen. And though neither of them knew it yet, the walls of that marble palace had already started to crack, not from scandal, but from the quiet, unrelenting power of human connection. The storm came without warning. One moment the London sky was pale and heavy, the next it tore open with thunder that shook the foundations of the Harrington mansion. Rain lashed against the glass like 1,000 small fists. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The house fell into darkness. Daniel was in the kitchen when it happened. The sudden silence that followed the blackout was unnerving, the kind of silence that swallowed even the sound of breath. He grabbed a flashlight and started toward the basement, certain the fuse had tripped. But halfway down the hall, he caught sight of something unexpected. Margaret Harrington stood in the east wing, motionless before a locked wooden door. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, pale, distant, almost haunted. "Mrs. Harrington?" Daniel said softly. "It's all right. I'll fix the power." But she didn't move. Her hand was on the door handle, fingers trembling. "It's been locked for 40 years, she whispered. Daniel hesitated. "What room is it?" She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "My husband's study." Another thunderclap cracked above them. For a long moment, they both stood in the flickering shadows, her breathing shallow, his pulse quickening with an instinct he couldn't explain. Margaret looked smaller than he'd ever seen her. "I thought, if I kept it locked I could stop time," she murmured, as though confessing a sin. "But time doesn't stop. It just walks past you and never looks back." Daniel raised his flashlight, sweeping it gently across the door. The brass keyhole glinted in the dim light. "Do you still have the key?" She nodded, reaching into the pocket of her robe. The small rusted key clinked faintly against her wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry she still wore. With a slow, deliberate motion, she slid it into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, as if protesting after decades of silence, then gave way with a reluctant click. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. Daniel stepped in first, lighting a candle from the hallway sconce. Its soft glow revealed a room frozen in another century. The walls were lined with books whose pages had yellowed, the shelves sagging under their weight. On the desk sat an old typewriter, a fountain pen, a glass paperweight shaped like a globe, all untouched, preserved beneath a film of time. And in the center, a framed photograph. A young Margaret smiled from it, radiant, ambitious, alive, standing beside a tall, severe-looking man. Her late husband, Charles Harrington. Even in the photo, he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed somewhere else, past the camera, past her. It was a detail so small and cruel that Daniel's heart ached just seeing it. Margaret's cane tapped once on the wooden floor before she slowly crossed the threshold. "He built this room for himself," she said, her voice barely audible. "He used to say it was where real work happened, the kind I wasn't meant to understand." He'd shut the door for hours. "I would wait outside with dinner until the candles burned out." Daniel said nothing. He simply lit more candles, placing them on the desk, the shelves, the mantel, until the room glowed softly with life again. Her fingers brushed across the dusty desk, leaving trails in the powder. She stared down at her own hand. "When he died, I told myself I wouldn't touch anything. That keeping it this way would keep him here somehow." She turned to Daniel, her eyes shimmering in the candlelight. "But maybe it wasn't him I was keeping. Maybe it was my own failure." Daniel set the last candle beside the photograph and stepped closer. "You didn't fail, Margaret," he said gently. "You survived." She gave a faint, broken laugh. "Survival isn't living." For a long time, neither spoke. The storm roared outside, thunder echoing through the house, but inside that room, time truly seemed to pause. The candle flames swayed with each breath they took. The air smelled of dust, ink, and old sorrow. "Finally," Daniel said, "you once told me you kept it locked to stop time. But time doesn't stop, ma'am. It just waits for you to forgive it." Her gaze lifted to his, startled by the simple truth in his words. No one had ever dared to speak to her that way, not her board, not her lawyers, not even her late husband. And yet, here stood a young man half her age, speaking to her as if she were still capable of forgiving, still capable of feeling. Something inside her shifted, a small crack in the fortress she'd built around her heart. She turned toward the photograph again. "He never loved me, you know. Not really. I was the convenient face for his empire. He gave me everything but affection. And when he died, I inherited his silence." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time you give it back." Her lips parted, a trembling breath escaped her, half a sigh, half a sob. For the first time in 40 years, she sat in her husband's chair. The wood creaked beneath her weight, and her eyes glistened with something fragile, almost childlike. "Would you help me light the rest?" she asked. Daniel nodded. Together they lit every candle until the room glowed with warmth, a sanctuary reborn from dust. The storm outside still raged, but it no longer sounded angry. It sounded like release. When the lights flickered back on, she blinked against their brightness. "You can go," she said softly. "I'll stay a while." But as Daniel turned to leave, she added, "Tomorrow. I want this room cleaned." He paused. "Should I tell the staff?" Her eyes met his. "No," she said firmly. "Only you. I trust no one else." The next morning, the mansion stirred differently. The air seemed lighter, the corridors warmer. Daniel spent the day dusting shelves, sorting letters, wiping away the evidence of decades of grief. He found a box of handwritten notes, all addressed to Margaret, all unopened. He placed them neatly in a drawer without reading a word. When she entered hours later, she stood quietly by the doorway. "It feels different," she murmured. "It's breathing again," Daniel said with a small smile. She nodded, almost shyly. "So am I." But outside the estate's tall iron gates, the whispers had already begun. The staff noticed the locked wing reopening, the way the young cleaner was the only one allowed inside. Rumors drifted into the city like sparks carried by the wind. By the time the week ended, journalists were calling the housekeeper the boy who softened the Queen of Steel. And for the first time in her long calculating life, Margaret Harrington didn't know whether to feel shame or hope. The fire burned low in the hearth, its orange light dancing across the marble walls like faint ghosts. Outside, the London rain came down in thin, deliberate lines, whispering against the glass windows. Inside, the great Harrington mansion was quiet, too quiet. Even the clocks seemed hesitant to tick. Margaret sat in her armchair near the fire, her robe draped around her like a frail crown. Her cane rested against the side table, forgotten. For years, she had faced down CEOs, ministers, and men who thought her power made her less of a woman. Tonight, none of that armor remained. Daniel was kneeling by the fireplace, feeding it one last piece of wood. The flicker of the flame lit his young face in amber and shadow. He looked up at her, the way one looks at something both fragile and eternal. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice that trembled but did not break, she said, "Daniel, before I leave this world, I want to know what it feels like to be held. Not for power, not for pity, but for being human." The words fell between them like shards of glass. Daniel froze. The sound of the fire filled the silence, crackling softly. He could hear the faint hum of rain through the walls, the slow rhythm of her breathing. She didn't look at him, she stared into the flames, her face illuminated in the light of confession. "I've spent a lifetime being looked at, Daniel," she continued. "Admired, feared, obeyed. But never loved. I don't even know what love sounds like when spoken honestly." Daniel's throat tightened. In that moment, the woman sitting before him was no longer the formidable CEO who had ruled empires. She was simply an old woman standing at the edge of life, stripped of legacy and pride, asking for the one thing she had never been given: tenderness. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "Margaret. I..." She turned her face away sharply, her composure cracking. "Forget I said it," she whispered. "It's foolish. You're young. You shouldn't have to carry the sorrow of an old woman's regret." The clock on the mantel ticked louder, each second stretching into eternity. Daniel could feel the weight of her loneliness pressing against the silence. It wasn't desire that filled the room, it was grief. Grief for everything she had sacrificed in the name of success. He rose slowly, his hands trembling. "It's not foolish," he said quietly. "It's human." But Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, the reflection of fire trembling in her pupils like the last spark of a fading soul. That night, neither of them slept. The next morning, the storm outside had passed, but another one was brewing, this time not in the sky, but in the world beyond the mansion's gates. Daniel arrived early, only to find the servants huddled around their phones. Their whispers stopped as soon as he entered. He caught fragments of sentences, the tabloids, the boy, her obsession. One of the maids thrust a newspaper toward him. The headline screamed across the page: "Billionaire recluse grows obsessed with her young housekeeper." A grainy photograph accompanied the story, Margaret's silhouette in the window, and his figure blurred in the background. It was enough to destroy them both. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He stormed into the study, where Margaret sat already holding the same paper. Her face was calm, eerily calm, like someone who had expected this moment all along. "They were bound to find something," she said softly. "The world has always been hungry for women who fall out of line." He paced the room, his hands clenched. "You don't deserve this. I'll go to the press. I'll..." She stopped him with a single look. "And tell them what, Daniel?" That an old woman confessed she wanted to feel human before she died? That she wanted to be held? They'll make it sound like madness. Or scandal. Or both. Her calmness only made it worse. Daniel felt helpless, furious. "Then let me protect you," he said. She smiled sadly. "They've taken everything from me before, my name, my company, my pride. I won't let them take this last piece, my truth." He stared at her, realizing that she had already made peace with the cost. The board of directors would force her resignation within days. The mansion, once her kingdom, would become her cage. Yet even now she looked lighter. The confession that had shamed her in public had, in some way, freed her in private. Outside, the world sharpened its knives. Inside, they sat together in silence. The flames in the fireplace flickered again, the same as the night before. She turned to him and said quietly, "They think I'm obsessed, Daniel. But they don't understand. What I wanted wasn't possession. It was remembrance." He frowned. "Remembrance?" "Yes," she whispered. "When people die, the world forgets them quickly. I just wanted to be remembered as someone who still had a heart." Daniel's eyes burned. "You will be." She smiled faintly, almost invisible. "Not by them. But perhaps by you." The fire crackled, and the ticking clock resumed its steady rhythm. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if listening to the sound of her own courage. The moment hung suspended, fragile as glass. And though the world outside screamed scandal, what existed between them was something gentler, a truth stripped bare of vanity or shame. She had spoken her wish aloud. He had heard it. And that was enough to make it real. Before the day ended, the phone rang, her lawyer, her PR firm, her board. She refused every call. The empire she built was slipping from her grasp, yet she didn't flinch. As night approached, the same question lingered between them, unspoken but heavy as the rain clouds forming once more above the city. If you were Daniel, would you stay, and stand beside her in ruin? Or would you walk away, to save your youth, your future, your name? The world outside demanded an answer. But inside that mansion, two hearts sat quietly beside a dying fire, finding something the world could never understand. A love not born from desire, but from the simple, aching need to be seen. The morning air around Kensington was electric with scandal. Outside the Harrington mansion, the world had come to feed. Reporters swarmed the iron gates like vultures circling something wounded but still alive. Cameras flashed through the fog. Microphones reached through the bars like weapons. Headlines bled across every screen and newspaper. Billionaire CEO loses grip on reality. Obsession with housekeeper sparks meltdown. The Ice Queen falls. Margaret Harrington's name, once synonymous with power, now trended as a punchline. They called her delusional, desperate, the woman who mistook loneliness for love. Daniel's name appeared too, the gold digger, the manipulator, the boy who brought down an empire. Inside, the mansion no longer felt like a home. It was a courtroom built of marble and memory. The ticking clocks that once marked order now sounded like judgment. Every hallway seemed to whisper, "Guilty." Margaret stood in her study, dressed in a dark navy suit that hung loosely on her frail frame. The woman who had once dominated boardrooms with a glance now faced her own directors in a private hearing held within her own house. They had gathered around her dining table like judges dressed in silk ties and polite cruelty. One of them cleared his throat. "Margaret, this story is damaging the company's reputation. Our shareholders are concerned. Your relationship with a staff member." She interrupted before he could finish. Her voice was soft, but the authority in it silenced the room. "His name is Daniel." A pause followed. Then she continued, her tone colder, sharper. "You built your empire on my name. My sweat, my brilliance, my reputation. And yet, the moment I act like a human being instead of a symbol, you call it weakness. Tell me, are you afraid of my mistakes, or my honesty?" The youngest board member shifted uncomfortably. "No one doubts your contributions, Mrs. Harrington, but this situation has created public outrage. We can't." She cut him off again, her voice trembling now not with anger but exhaustion. "You can't afford to see me as human. Because if I'm human, then every one of you will have to face the cost of your own masks." Silence. Only the sound of rain outside. Then, with the calm precision of men who'd already decided, the chairman spoke. We're asking for your resignation, effective immediately. You'll retain your properties and holdings, but your leadership is over." Daniel, standing quietly near the back of the room, clenched his fists. Margaret's eyes didn't move. She simply inhaled, straightened her back, and said, "Then strip me of it. All of it. But remember this, when your empire crumbles under its own greed, my name will still be carved in its foundation." No one replied. They filed out in silence, their umbrellas opening against the storm. When the last door closed, the mansion seemed to sigh, a long, tired breath of surrender. Daniel turned toward her. "You don't deserve this," he said. She smiled faintly. "Deserve has nothing to do with it, Daniel. The world doesn't punish lies, it punishes truths spoken by the wrong mouths." Later that afternoon, he was summoned to the office by the estate manager. The message was blunt: "You are to leave your post immediately. Mrs. Harrington's employment of you has ended." He signed the papers quietly, his hands shaking. As he left the mansion, the paparazzi swarmed him. Flash after flash, questions fired like bullets. Did she pay you? Were you sleeping with her? Did you manipulate the old woman for money? He didn't answer. The rain drowned their voices. That night, London was soaked in thunder and light. Daniel stood at the gates of the Harrington estate once more, his umbrella useless against the downpour. He could have walked away. It would have been easy, logical, safe. He could have saved his reputation, found another job, erased his name from her tragedy. But his heart wouldn't let him. He opened the gate, his clothes clinging to his skin, and crossed the courtyard. The windows were dark except for the faint glow of the study upstairs. He climbed the marble steps and knocked once. The door opened slowly. Margaret stood there, her face pale against the firelight. Her hair was loose, her robe draped unevenly around her. For the first time, she looked every bit her age. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. "You shouldn't be." He didn't answer at first. Rain dripped from his hair onto the floor. "Because you shouldn't be alone," he said finally. Her gaze trembled, torn between fear and disbelief. "You'll ruin your life for me," she whispered. "They'll never let you work again. They'll mock you, destroy you." He stepped closer. "Let them. You taught me something they never could, that compassion is rarer than wealth." She froze, her lips parting just slightly. The words seemed to fill the space between them like light cutting through fog. "Daniel," she began, but her voice broke. He shook his head gently. "You once said you wanted to be remembered as someone who had a heart. You will be, because I saw it." For a long time, they stood in silence, the only sound the rain whispering against the windows. Downstairs, the flashing cameras continued to light up the night like lightning, but they didn't move. They had found something stronger than the noise outside, a quiet truth that belonged to them alone. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for his. Her palm was cool, her grip weak, but in that touch lived everything unspoken between them: forgiveness, gratitude, and something close to love. "I don't know how this ends," she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither do I. But for once, let it end with dignity." And as thunder rolled across the city, Margaret Harrington, once the most feared woman in London, stood hand in hand with the only person who had ever dared to see her heart. Outside, the headlines screamed scandal. Inside, the rain whispered redemption. And now the story pauses, leaving one question hanging in the stormy air. If you were Daniel, would you have come back? Would you risk everything to stand beside the one the world chose to destroy? Because sometimes, the true trial of dignity isn't what the world does to you, but what you're willing to do for someone the world refuses to understand. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke, not in the skies, but in the hearts of those who had made Margaret Harrington's downfall their favorite spectacle. It started as whispers in the newspapers, then headlines, then graffiti scrawled across her mansion's front gates in red paint: "Witch. Cougar. Disgrace." One night, while the rain drizzled softly over Kensington, a group of masked intruders slipped through the estate's rear gate. They left chaos in their wake: ripped curtains, broken portraits, overturned furniture. The great marble floors that once reflected Margaret's authority now lay scarred with cruel words and shattered glass. By the time Daniel arrived the next morning, the police had already come and gone. Margaret sat in her study amidst the wreckage, her robe drawn tightly around her frail body. The fire had long since gone out. The air smelled of ashes and wet stone. Her empire had finally collapsed, not with lawsuits or resignations, but with ridicule. The media had devoured her reputation. The board had stripped her of power. The world she once ruled had turned its back. And yet, in her eyes, there was no anger left. Only exhaustion. "They can take my empire," she whispered as Daniel entered the room, her voice weak but steady. "But not the choice to die on my own terms." He froze. The words pierced him deeper than any insult hurled from outside those gates. "Don't say that," he said softly, stepping closer. "You've survived worse." She looked up at him, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at her lips. "Daniel, I've survived everything. That's the problem." Her hand trembled as she reached for a stack of letters on the desk, letters sealed but never sent. "Do you know what these are?" she asked. "Apologies. To people I wronged. To people I loved too late. To the woman I used to be before ambition devoured her." Daniel took the letters gently and set them aside. "It's not too late to send them." Margaret's gaze drifted toward the cracked window. The sky outside was streaked with the faintest hint of dawn. "Some things belong to silence," she murmured. "The world doesn't deserve to read my regrets." He knelt beside her chair, trying to catch her fading focus. "Then let me stay with you tonight," he said. "You shouldn't be alone." Her eyes softened. "You're too young to carry ghosts, Daniel." "Then let me carry one," he said simply. Something inside her broke at his words, not in pain, but in surrender. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. The great house around them was still, stripped of all pretense. Every echo had become an elegy. That night, Daniel built a fire in the hearth. The light flickered weakly, illuminating the cracked portraits, the torn curtains, and the dust floating like memory in the air. Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket, her silver hair glowing softly in the warmth. She looked at him, not with authority, not with gratitude, but with an unspoken tenderness that needed no name. "Do you know," she began, her voice fragile, "I spent my youth in rooms like this, surrounded by men who called me brilliant but never once asked if I was happy?" Daniel said nothing. He just listened. "I missed my own wedding reception because my husband wanted to discuss stock acquisitions," she continued. "I never went dancing, though I loved music. I never wrote the letters I meant to. I never let anyone see me cry. I thought strength meant silence." Her eyes glistened as she turned toward the fire. "But it's silence that kills you, Daniel. Slowly. Softly. Until one day, you wake up and realize the only voice you've silenced is your own." He swallowed hard. The firelight shimmered between them, making her look almost ethereal, half woman, half memory. "I wish I'd met you when I was young," she whispered suddenly. He smiled faintly. "I don't think you'd have noticed me." "Oh, I would have," she said. "I'd have thought you were too kind for the world I was building." A quiet laugh escaped her, fragile as glass. The sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The fire crackled softly. Time seemed to stretch thin, almost still. At last, Margaret reached out, her hand trembling slightly. Daniel hesitated for just a second before taking it in his own. Her skin was cold but steady. The contact bridged two lifetimes, hers, nearly ending, and his, just beginning. No words passed between them. None were needed. The silence that once suffocated the house now felt peaceful, healing. Outside, the rain eased into a mist. The mansion, scarred and broken, glowed faintly in the moonlight. It stood not as a monument to power anymore, but as a resting place for truth, a place where love, once forbidden, had finally taken root in the ruins. Margaret's breathing slowed. "When I die," she whispered, "promise me you'll burn the letters. Let my past go with me." "I promise," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "Good," she murmured, eyes half closed. "Then perhaps I can go quietly, like the house I built, burning but with dignity." He held her hand tighter. The night stretched on. The fire dimmed. And when dawn came, the mansion stood still, cloaked in silence once more. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, almost holy. Margaret Harrington, the woman the world had mocked and misunderstood, had found what she had been searching for all along, not redemption, not forgiveness, but understanding. And Daniel, sitting beside her in the fading glow, realized that sometimes love doesn't roar, it whispers. It doesn't demand to be seen, it endures quietly, like embers that refuse to die even after the flames have gone. That morning, the papers would scream new headlines about disgrace and downfall. But in that mansion, that hollow broken palace of glass, the truth burned quietly, beautifully, one last time. The first rays of dawn broke over London, brushing the rooftops of Kensington in pale gold. Inside the Harrington mansion, the silence was absolute. The storm had passed. The air hung heavy with stillness, the kind that comes not before tragedy, but after it. Daniel awoke on the couch by the fireplace, his clothes wrinkled, his body stiff from the long night. The embers in the hearth had cooled to a dull red glow. For a moment he didn't remember falling asleep, only the rhythm of the rain, the weight of Margaret's hand in his, and the whisper of her final words lingering in the air. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as though he were afraid of breaking the fragile peace that filled the house. The mansion, once alive with footsteps, commands, and whispers, now felt sacred, like a cathedral after prayer. He called her name softly. Margaret. No response. Only the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the house, the same clock that had marked every hour of her solitude. He walked toward the study, where the morning sun spilled through the tall windows, painting the room in soft amber. And there she was. Margaret Harrington sat in her chair by the fireplace, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her eyes were closed, her head slightly tilted as though she were listening to the wind outside. A faint, peaceful smile rested on her lips, one that seemed to erase the years of bitterness and pain. Daniel froze in the doorway. For a moment, he almost believed she had simply fallen asleep. But the stillness of her chest told him otherwise. He stepped closer, his heart pounding, his throat tightening. "Margaret," he whispered again, even though part of him already knew. He touched her shoulder gently, her skin cool, her expression serene. There was no fear in her face. No regret. Only release. Daniel sank to his knees beside her chair. Tears welled but refused to fall. Around them, the house stood silent, a witness to her final act of peace. On the table beside her, the letters she had asked him to burn were gone. Only a single sheet of paper remained, folded neatly beneath a small white rose from the garden. He opened it with trembling hands. In her unmistakable handwriting, she had written, "Don't mourn me, Daniel. The world may call this a scandal, but I call it mercy. For the first time, I wasn't the woman they expected me to be, I was the woman I always wanted to be. Kindness is not scandal, Daniel. It's courage." He read it again, until the words blurred into tears. By mid-morning, the estate gates were surrounded once more. The tabloids had found their next headline. The scandal that ended in death. Billionaire recluse found dead in her mansion. Love or madness? Inside the final days of Margaret Harrington. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions through the iron bars. But Daniel didn't answer any of them. He walked past them all silent, carrying the small letter in his pocket as though it were the only truth that mattered. Days later, the funeral was held at St. John's Chapel, a modest ceremony for a woman whose name had once commanded entire industries. No family came. Her distant relatives sent polite condolences through lawyers. The board members who had forced her resignation attended out of obligation, standing in the back like ghosts. It was the employees, the maids, the cooks, the gardeners, who filled the front rows, their eyes cast down, their faces heavy with shame. Each of them carried the quiet guilt of having gossiped about her, judged her, misunderstood her. Daniel stood at the front, dressed simply in black. When the priest finished the final prayer, he stepped forward. The rain had begun again, soft, almost forgiving, tapping against the chapel windows as though even the heavens mourned her passing. He placed a single white rose on her casket. His voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "You weren't a monster," he said. "You were human. And you finally got to be." The words hung in the air, weightless and eternal. He bowed his head, tears finally breaking free, and walked away before the cameras outside could capture his grief. As he stepped out of the chapel, the city moved on, indifferent, impatient. Another scandal would replace hers soon enough. But for Daniel, time had stopped. He returned to the mansion one last time. The house stood empty now, stripped of its furniture, its portraits, its life. Only dust motes drifted through the sunbeams, dancing like the souls of memories too stubborn to die. He walked through the rooms in silence. The grand hall where he'd first met her, the east wing where the secret room had been unlocked, the study where her laughter had returned for the first time in decades. When he reached the window overlooking the garden, he paused. The roses were blooming again, despite the season, fragile and white against the damp earth. He smiled faintly. "You'd have liked that," he murmured. He took the letter from his pocket, read her final line once more. "Kindness is not scandal, Daniel. It's courage," and slipped it into the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, curling the paper into light. As the words turned to ash, Daniel whispered goodbye. He left the mansion without looking back. Outside, police cars idled by the gates, reporters hovered with their microphones ready, but Daniel walked past them, calm and silent. The rain soaked his shoulders, but he didn't raise his umbrella. Each drop felt like a benediction, a final farewell. The cameras shouted after him, "Was she in love with you? Did she confess before she died?" But he said nothing. Some stories, he knew, were not meant for the world to understand. He reached the end of the street, turned once more toward the mansion, the house that had once been a fortress of pride, then a prison of shame, and finally, a place of quiet redemption. And as the clouds parted, sunlight fell upon its windows, glinting faintly, not as fire this time but as grace. Daniel took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Because in the end, it wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about the world's noise, or judgment, or lies. It was about two souls who had met too late, yet just in time to save what was left of each other. And as he disappeared into the London streets, the question lingered, one that would echo long after the headlines faded. Was it love? Or something deeper, the salvation of two broken hearts who, for one fleeting moment, found peace in the ruins of time? If this story moved you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Somewhere out there is another soul, proud, quiet, maybe forgotten, carrying a heart that has waited too long to be seen. Let this story remind us that compassion is never weakness, and kindness is not a scandal, it's courage. Because in a world obsessed with power, the bravest thing we can do is care, even when it costs us. So if this touched you, share it with someone who's lost faith in tenderness. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that prove it's never too late to rediscover your own humanity.